All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are tackling one of the biggest questions out there. What is a religious experience? I mean, is it a real connection with something divine? Or is it all just a trick of the mind? Let's figure this out.
I want you to think for a second. Have you ever had a moment of just pure awe? Maybe watching a sunrise or getting totally lost in a piece of music. A feeling so big, so powerful, that when you tried to explain it later, words just failed you. We're starting here because that exact feeling is right at the heart of everything we're about to explore. The philosopher William James was wrestling with this very same problem more than 100 years ago. And his point here is just brilliant. He's saying, look, if you've never been in love, someone trying to describe it to you is going to sound a little crazy. It's the same thing with these profound experiences. If you haven't felt it, it's really, really easy to just dismiss it. So if we're dealing with something that's literally beyond words, how do we even start to analyze it? Well, you start by building a framework. You have to try and define what it is we're even talking about. The term that thinkers like James landed on is mystical experience. For him, these incredibly intense, all-consuming moments weren't some fringe part of religion. No, he argued they were the very core of it. He believed all the doctrines, the churches, the holy books, all of that was what he called secondhand religion. The real stuff, the primary source, were these direct, personal experiences. To bring some order to the chaos, James came up with a kind of 4-point checklist. First, he said an experience has to be ineffable. That's just a fancy word for you can't describe it. Second, it's noetic. This means it feels like you've been given some profound truth or knowledge, like a sudden download of insight. Third, it's transient. It doesn't last. It's a fleeting moment. And finally, it's passive. You're not in the driver's seat here. This is something that happens to you.
Okay, so with that definition locked in, let's explore the argument that says these aren't just powerful feelings. This is the case that they are actual encounters with something real, something outside of ourselves. This was the big puzzle for William James. He looked across history, across all these different cultures and religions, and he saw something amazing. He saw mystics who had nothing in common describing their experiences in remarkably similar ways. They all seemed to tick his 4 boxes, and he thought, there's no way this is just a coincidence. For James, the only explanation that made sense was that everyone, no matter their background, was tapping into one single common source, a higher spiritual reality that each culture was just interpreting and describing using its own language and symbols. Now, a more modern philosopher, Richard Swinburne, makes a much more down-to-earth case. He says we should just use common sense. His principle of credulity is simple. Trust your senses. If it looks like there's a chair in front of you, you believe there's a chair, right? So if it feels like a divine presence is in the room, your default setting should be to believe it, unless, you have a good reason not to. And his principle of testimony says we should extend that same trust to other people. Basically, he's saying we should take these accounts seriously as evidence, not dismiss them out of hand. But, and this is a huge but, there is another side to this story. A very powerful counterargument that says the source of all this isn't out there at all. It's deep inside our own skulls. And this really brings us to the main event. It's a showdown between 2 competing explanations. On one side, you've got people like James and Swinburne who argue for a genuine spiritual source. And on the other side, you have figures like Sigmund Freud and Michael Persinger who say, hold on, we think the brain can explain all of this. Freud's take was, well, pretty blunt. He saw religion as a kind of psychological crunch. He argued that deep down, we're all terrified of death and overwhelmed by life, so we basically invent a cosmic father figure, God, to make us feel safe, like we're children again. For him, a religious experience was just a form of wish fulfillment, a powerful hallucination. Fast forward a few decades, and the challenge becomes less psychological and more neurological. A scientist named Michael Persinger created this device that got nicknamed the God helmet. And what it did was use magnetic fields to stimulate specific parts of the brain. The result? Some people wearing the helmet reported feeling an unseen presence in the room with them. This was huge because it suggested that these profound spiritual feelings could be triggered, that they might just be a byproduct of brain chemistry. Okay, so we've got 2 completely different theories on the table, the divine versus the brain. How do they actually stack up when we look at some famous real-world examples? Let's find out. Let's take one of the most famous stories of all time, Saul on the road to Damascus. From the religious viewpoint, it's simple. God intervened, and Saul became Paul. Case closed. But this psychological view would say, hang on, what if Saul was having a major internal crisis and his brain produced a powerful, life-altering hallucination to resolve that conflict? Now, William James would jump in here and say, look at the results. The man changed the course of history for the better. That's his pragmatism talking. If it has good effects, treat it as true. But a psychologist would fire back, sure, the effects were real, but the cause was all in his head.
So what about when it's not just one person? What about when a whole group of people feel something at the exact same time? Like the Toronto blessing, where an entire church was overcome with emotion. Believers would say, see, one person can be mistaken, but not a whole crowd. Skeptics, though, they have a term for this, mass hysteria. They'd argue that in a highly emotional group setting, people can influence each other into a shared psychological state.
And all of this leads us to one final, massive philosophical problem. If these experiences are real glimpses of the divine, why do they all look so different? Here's the core of the issue. A Christian mystic has an experience of Jesus. A Buddhist monk has an experience of nirvana. A Hindu sage experiences Brahman. The problem is, these religions make claims that contradict each other. So if the Christian's experience is proof that Christianity is true, doesn't that mean the Buddhist's experience is wrong? They can't all be the one ultimate truth, can they? The philosopher John Hick came up with a really beautiful way to think about this problem. He used the ancient parable of the blind men and the elephant. You know the story, right? One man touches the elephant's leg and says it's a tree. Another touches the tail and says it's a rope. A third touches the tusk and thinks it's a spear. They're all describing something real, but none of them can see the whole picture. Hick's idea, which is called pluralism, is that maybe ultimate reality, God or the divine, is the elephant. And every religion is just one of the blind men, correctly describing their own limited piece of a reality that's too big for any single one of them to grasp completely. And that's where we're left. On one side, we have the undeniable power of personal, life-changing experience. And on the other, the cool, compelling logic of scientific and psychological explanation. So the final question is really for you to ponder. When it all comes down to it, what carries more weight for you? The experience or the explanation? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.